This episode is brought to you by the Jordan Harbinger Show. Okay, everyone, summer's coming, so it's time to get your summer reading list together. But there are going to be times when you're too tired to hold a book or some electronic device. Sometimes you want to just lie there and let someone else do all the work. And that means a podcast. And I recommend that podcast be a top shelf podcast named Best of Apple in 2018. One that brings on fascinating people, athletes, authors, and scientists, to mobsters and spies. I'm talking about, of course, the Jordan Harbinger Show. Either entertain me or inform me, and that's what Jordan does with each and every episode. Let me recommend 2 specific episodes to you. I suggest listening to episode 655, David Eagleman, How Our Brains Construct Reality, and episode 662, Daniel J. Levitin, How to Think Critically in the Post-Truth Era. You can't go wrong with adding the Jordan Harbinger Show to your rotation. It's incredibly interesting. There's never a dull show. Search for the Jordan Harbinger Show. That's Harb as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome to Pax Britannica. Bonus episode. The East India Company with Dr. David Veevers. Today, I'm thrilled to speak to Dr. David Veevers, Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Veevers has recently published his monograph, The Origins of the British Empire in Asia, 1600 to 1750, which is a brilliant read, and I've been eager to get him on this podcast since hearing that it was out, and I've read it in the last few weeks, and it is fantastic. So, Dr. Veevers, thank you for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I've wanted to come on. Listening to the podcast over the summer, fantastic podcast. So thank you. Any chance for a captive audience?
Let's jump right in. In the introduction of your book, you explicitly refer to it as a revisionist interpretation of the early East India Company. So for the benefit of listeners, would you be able to just briefly summarize that historiography and explain where you see yourself within it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think really what the book hopefully does is addresses the sort of 2 different strands of historiography, which the book kind of juggles and situates itself in, and one of those strands in particular it really hopes to revise. So really it's about the historiography around how the company operated, and by extension how overseas European enterprises operated in the early modern period, and that's there's such a rich historiography in the past 10 years, especially for the English East India Company. It's really drawn attention to corporations and the corporate origins of empire, not just in Asia but also in places like the Atlantic where corporations have kind of been overlooked. If you think about during the 17th century you had companies establishing territorial empires in Virginia, in Massachusetts, the Hudson's Bay Company, and when I say empire, obviously that ranges from territorial to commercial, and of course most famously the Dutch and English East India Companies, and later the French, the Danish, and even the Swedish. So the kind of corporate model of empire has really kind of taken hold in the past 10 years. One of my concerns, and that's been a fabulous contribution to showing how the East India Company in its earlier period was a political actor. So where traditional historiographies look at the company as predominantly commercial and then only becoming a political or colonial actor in the later 18th century, and in the Indian context, especially with the Battle of Plassey and the assumption of territorial rule in Bengal. But the kind of past 10 years have blown that trade to empire narrative up by looking at this kind of corporate structure and the way in which companies were highly autonomous political actors able to, wage war, raise taxes, maintain sovereign jurisdictions, engage in diplomacy. And that's been really interesting. And I should probably say that's largely been led by, starting with Phil Stern's work, his book, The Company State in 2011. And since then, the historiography's grown. Most recently, I've just read and reviewed Andrew Phillips and Jason Sharman's Outsourcing Empire, which is a great synthesis of the research that's been done in this area. And that predominantly comes from the idea that European states in the early modern period were weak, relatively weak fiscally and militarily, and had to sort of kind of outsource empire building to these private initiatives, and that were able to pool their resources and to manage overseas trade and diplomacy in a way that sovereign nation states can't. So that's been rich. My main concern is that the work on that's been predominantly from an English perspective. This and its kind of contribution to global history has been the way in which corporations, operated globally and often, brought these global interests together. But it's been predominantly kind of Eurocentric wave of research. So it's looking at corporations as uniquely European initiatives. There's been a lot of work on English political economy and the way in which corporations grew from these ideas of mercantilism. And so for me, it didn't show corporations in their true kind of contribution to empire making, which was as these kind of very flexible, porous private initiatives that could integrate with other cultures and other political systems, and the way in which their autonomy gave them a significant amount of independence from the interests of the nation state. So that's a strand of historiography I was really interested in. How did the company operate? And for me, it kind of revises that kind of projection as that companies were arms of European nation states, and actually their private function gave them great scope to, in many ways, transform themselves, to insinuate themselves with foreign cultures and political systems. And my book's very much about their transformation into more or less Asian powers, and the way in which they didn't always serve the interests of their domicile nation states in the way that they were intended to. So there's that kind of strand. How did overseas corporations operate? What was the East India Company? But really, I think hopefully the more significant contribution the book's made is this idea of how that intersects with research done on early modern Asian state and empire formation. This idea in the sort of 10, 15 years, especially Mughal historiography, that the Mughal Empire was a kind of decentered kind of web of clients and networks, and this coming away from the old kind of Richard's interpretation of Asian empires as territorial plunder machines, as centralized powers that gradually decline with the onset of European expansion. So it's actually looking at the way Asian empires were actually resilient and durable systems by the way in which they integrated foreign elements into their imperial frameworks, and that helped them to become more economically and more politically robust, so that they didn't necessarily see the East India companies as a threat, as more as an opportunity to utilize them as clients and as allies to help consolidate their own authority. And there's been lots of work done on that recently, but I mean, really my starting point was Sanjay Subramanian's kind of theory of contained conflict, which kind of re-emphasized from the 1990s the way in which there was a kind of parity in the early modern period between Asian states and European communities. And I think, I can't remember the quote off by heart, but Sanjay Subramanian said that, the 17th and 18th century was this kind of period of like a long jostling and neither party getting an upper hand. And that kind of historiography is developed. And a really good recent example is Adam Clulow's the Dutch company and the shogun, looking at the Dutch in Japan and the way in which the Tokugawa shogunate was able to completely contain the Dutch and limit their expansion and really exercised complete power over this kind of thriving European enterprise. So hopefully my book kind of contributes that, but it really is revisionist, I hopefully, in the way in which for the Dutch in Japan, or maybe the Portuguese in Western India, there's a case to be made for Asian states overpowering Europeans and limiting and containing them. But for me, in the English experience in Southeast Asia in the early modern period, that powerlessness, that subordination to Asian power really was the kind of key strength of the English East India Company, because it enabled it to kind of adopt this subordinate dynamic that, as a trusted and loyal and useful client of the Mughal Empire, it was well rewarded, and gradually over time it kind of really assembled this rather astonishing empire within an empire, so that by the middle of the 18th century it already governs a kind of network of towns and cities and has thousands and thousands of subjects paying revenue, and it's the largest trader in Asian goods. So it was that idea that subordination to Asian states wasn't a way to limit Europeans, but it actually facilitated their expansion. So that was really revising that historiography to show that European empires didn't necessarily project their force against European states, but often worked within Asian frameworks, that these systems were resilient and robust and durable and able to accommodate Europeans, not necessarily as antagonists, but as subordinates and clients. So there's that kind of two strands then that hopefully the book's engaged with and ambitiously try to revise to some extent as well.
It's interesting you bring up the Eurocentrism of previous histories, because something else you highlight is that in your book, in comparison to earlier works, you're not really interested in the official papers and charters and such that came out of England, but more the records from those on the ground, from the factories. And so you show the debates and the arguments and the reactions to decisions made in the metropole and how they affect the people on the ground. And I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So methodologically speaking, I mean, it really was about flipping the perspective as much as possible. I mean, even still, most of our histories of the English East India Company, are very metropolitan skewed. There's very much about what did the directors want, what were the shareholders investing in, who were the people that were sent out, and what were their initiatives and aims. And it just helped to really reduce the agency and the significance of the kind of Asian context in which they were operating, especially the kind of recent research on the overseas corporation as this kind of powerful actor. It kind of ignored the way in which, the moment you kind of sailed past the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, what you wanted and what your directors hoped you would do was entirely relegated to what you're able to achieve and what the powerful, the superpowers of the early modern world, the Safavid Persian or the Mughal or the Qing Empire, what they would tolerate and what they would be willing to allow. So for me, it was about, we're looking at the development of the East India Company from the wrong perspective. And that's partly, I think, methodological because of the richness of the East India Company archive. And that isn't to say that factory records haven't been used. They have, but often it's the correspondence of London to the factories in Asia, which often are privileged and are taken as a kind of foundation for understanding the company's growth. And that's why you get English figures having a kind of rather kind of skewed role in understanding English expansion. It's kind of figures like Hosea Child, the kind of famous Tory political economist that was also governor of the East India Company. And for me, these weren't the actors that we really should have been focusing on, because in the early modern period, power dynamic was skewed heavily in favor of the Asian elites that company servants dealt with. So for me, the factory records give kind of not an unblemished, these are still carefully framed sources because most of them had to be sent back to Europe every year for the director's consumption. And therefore they were often kind of heavily framed to provide a certain perspective. But generally, they also included dissenting opinions. They included eyewitness affidavits, all of these kind of really interesting sources which allow us to kind of peek at under the hood and see, if not quite the day-to-day events unfolding in factories in Asia, but certainly gave us I think a less manipulated picture. And then that's when you get the glimpse of all these fascinating Asian actors, which are often marginalized in if we look at it from the perspective of London or the directors. Everything from Sumatran pepper farmers to Mughal governors and their extended families. So alongside factory records, things like memorandum, travel accounts, personal diaries of people that traveled out from Europe and stayed temporarily in Asia. And there are some fabulous ones, more famous ones like the Diary of William Hedges or Strangeland Master. But at the Huntington in America, there's a fantastic diary by a man who's just been kicked off the court, kicked out of the court of directors, and he travels around Asia, basically touring the company's presence and slagging everyone off from Hosea Child onwards. And he gives this great critical account, but one in which it provides a counter narrative to the one that's been largely manufactured and fed to us through the company's correspondence. So I really wanted to come away from that London-centric, Eurocentric perspective, and I tried to do that as much as well. So yeah, the sources are heavily rooted in Asia. It's the factory records, it's the diaries of people on the spot, and it's private correspondence as well to family and friends back home that escape that kind of official reproduction of events. So I think I say near the start of the book, hopefully this is a an account of the British Empire in which the genesis of this empire is in Asia. This is where the real growth and development of the company happens, and it's not led by directors and political economists in London. It's led by Asian emperors and ministers and governors and and hopefully more subaltern actors as well. So yeah, so I went in it very purposely to flip that perspective and look at how does the company develop from an Asian perspective, and it is really different. I think it's one of failure, adaptation, and subordination, which isn't the usual narrative that we have for something as triumphant as the East India Company.
I think you illustrate that quite well when you make the point that once you sail past the Cape of Good Hope, it doesn't matter if you've got a charter from the king or instructions from the director. If the emperor at Delhi says no, it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
their power is limited to their own kingdoms essentially and their own spheres of influence. And I thought that was a very obvious and yet somehow easy to overlook reality.
Yeah.
And just to speak more about those Asian actors, like you mentioned, what world were these company agents actually experiencing? What did they find when they set up shop? Now, in Pax Britannica, we've last really looked at the East India Company, I think, from the 1620s onwards. So they've already got Surat, and I think they have Masulipatam.
That's right. Yeah, from 1611. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But what world are they dealing with? What is going on in Asia?
Yeah.
Nice simple thing. A whole century, a whole continent.
But I think it's a good question because you're framing it because often when we pick up histories of the East India Company's earlier period, they're already in the know and established, and that's just a process that happens over a very long time. And I think that we don't pay enough attention to how did they get to that point in which they're successful. And this is partly my problem with some of the existing works on the East India Company. They often pick up the story from sort of 1758 onwards, when the company has made a permanent joint stock corporation. But actually, you've got over half a century of history in which the company is grappling with its new environment, it's learning, it's failing, it's adapting. The winning formula doesn't really kick in until that later 17th century period. So for me, to understand what the company becomes and how it fits into narratives of the British Empire later on, we really need to understand how it got to that point. So I think it's a good question. Really, there's two ways of looking at this, and I kind of hopefully touched on these in the book. The first one is that they're on the coattails of other Europeans, some newly established or establishing themselves, and others long established. So I really think the great two influences on the English as they round the Cape of Good Hope at the beginning of the 17th century is they're doing it with the Dutch. I think that's really important. And there's been some great research that's hardly a neglected period of study. I think Alison Games most recently has really taken a comparative look at the English and the Dutch. But what we kind of less focus on is the way that they're at the same time learning to get to grips with this. the Indian Ocean world is, the center of the world in the 17th century. It's home to the world's superpowers, whether it's the Ottoman, Persian, Mughal, Chinese, or Japanese. It's the center of world trade. The English are, completely and utterly the underdogs. And one of the things they discover early on, as do the Dutch, is that what they have to offer is not really what's in demand in Asia. So there's a kind of period of turbulence in which the company were hoping to open what they call new marts to vent their goods, predominantly, English woolens, and tin and lead, none of which are wanted in Asia. And I mean, there's a great, but the first factory they set up was the Sultanate of Bantam in Archipelago, Indonesia, and they import massive amounts of English woolens, and it sits there for months and months. The only goods they're able to sell is to convince some of the elites at Bantam that they make fabulous horse saddles to be lined with soft English woolens, and they do flog a few, but other than that they realize that in a place that produces silk and some of the most beautiful and luxurious textiles in the world, a coarse English woolen is just not in demand. So there's a period of commercial failure and adaptation, that the English realize that if they don't have anything to offer, then they need to find the goods within Asia that they can sell. So there's a period like the Dutch in which the first 20 or 30 years they're learning to tap into the intra-Asian trade, and that is kind of buying in India and selling in Southeast Asia. So there's that's the first upset for this idea of the company being an instrument of the English nation state. Is that it's set up to increase English trade and to find new markets. But what actually happens is the company is forced to operate within the Asian commercial system, which has been well established for centuries or thousands of years. And there's no room for English mercantilist designs or demands. So they're operating with the Dutch. The Dutch are obviously more belligerent in enforcing their commercial aims, and there's obviously a very famous race for the Spice Islands, which is developing. But the interesting thing about the Anglo-Dutch experience is that the English weakness or failure to really establish themselves, they just don't have the capital or the resources to participate in the intra-Asian trade. Like the Dutch do. The Dutch are, fiscally and commercially far more successful. So after the first 2 decades, they're forced to. They don't really join a union with the Dutch East India Company, but the English Crown and the Dutch states create a kind of joint Anglo-Dutch presence in the Indian Ocean, where the English have to abandon English factories and move in with the Dutch, and they basically surrender their participation in the trade. They pay for half of the upkeep of all Dutch fortresses and factories and cities, and in exchange they're given 1/3 of the profits. And it's the Dutch that are conducting all of the trade and dealing with Asian elites. And in a way it's not a bad deal, because the English are so uncompetitive and they are hemorrhaging so much money that they can just sit back and enjoy 1/3 of this massive profit. But they lose the opportunity to forge durable personal relationships with Asian elites and rulers and communities. And they realize this after about 10 years, that they've been completely squeezed out. And one of the powerful lessons from that kind of rubbish period of joining with the Dutch is that they to succeed commercially, they have to have a social and cultural presence, and that the kind of very kind of profitable Indian Ocean world of trade relies on personal and familial connections, for example, kinship between different trading partners. So the company by 1620 are out on their own again, especially after the massacre of Amboina, which sends the English sort of scurrying from Dutch partnership. And the focus becomes more on integrating themselves with some of these major commercial powers, establishing mixed race families and getting to know who the movers and shakers are in some of the key ports like Surat, and to establish a kind of more permanent presence in the landscape. So that's they're kind of feeling their way around this failure. There's a brief flirtation with joining with the Dutch, but the lesson about the 1620s and 30s is they can't just come and go and get what they want. They have to establish a permanent presence, and one that's firmly rooted in the landscapes they're operating in. So they begin to move to new areas in which they can put down roots, and have some kind of viable presence. But the other one is that obviously it's the Portuguese. The Portuguese are the great success story of European presence in Asia, not in the respect of Portuguese Empire, and the kind of Goa-centric narrative of the Portuguese, which is one based on territory of fortresses and colonies. That's kind of under massive strain and decline by the 1620s and 30s. But rather, it's like the Portuguese diaspora, the way in which the Portuguese presence shifts from Portuguese sovereign spaces to spreading out across the Indian Ocean and establishing mixed race Portuguese communities in all the major towns and ports of the Indian Ocean world. And that creates a thriving informal Portuguese presence across the Indian Ocean and into China and Japan as well. And that's more what the English start to tap into. And there's a lot of kind of marriage into these Portuguese communities, and they are a mixture, and that's really important thing. The kind of racial and national categories of the Portuguese presence is very nuanced. There are Portuguese, and then there are Mestizo, and there are mixed race, and there's that kind of gives them this nebulous and porous presence, which helps them establish themselves across so many different kind of political and cultural borders. And the English start to tap into this, and when they open up new settlements, they invite these Portuguese communities in because they're a great kind of, they've established this kind of pre-existing Euro-Asian network of trade and cultural understanding, and to tap into that is really the key to success for the company in that first half of the 17th century. So in a way, they kind of move away from that Dutch experience and they embrace more the Portuguese experience, which is informal, personal and private networks, and they help anchor the English more firmly into the kind of commercial systems of India and the wider area. Slightly full answer. I'm sorry, you've got me talking now.
I gave you a broad question, so that was a brilliant answer. And clearly, this new approach worked. I think you refer to, he may be a little bit later than when we're talking about, but you refer to Thomas Clarke of Masulipatam as a petty king almost, who has taken these lessons to heart, and he is dishing out favor, and he is in contact with the local elites.
Yeah.
But he's not the only one by far, is he?
No, he's not. So he's really the first one in the archive I can trace in being this situation where he's kind of disassociated himself to a degree from kind of the East India Company as an English enterprise. And while he remains the English chief on the Coromandel coast, he's more, when the new English arrive to work in the region, they're kind of stunned by what he's transitioned to. So the company is kind of beset by kind of financial and political crisis in the 1630s. Charles I has allowed its monopoly to drop, and it's being challenged by various English merchant enterprises that are coming out to Asia. So it's not now the only English presence. And politically, obviously, England is sliding into kind of constitutional disaster with the British Civil Wars. So there's a kind of strain on the company, which forces it to retrench its presence, and less investment, less shipping. The English presence is kind of on the brink of collapsing entirely. And every monsoon, every fleet that comes from England to Asia, the first thing people in Asia ask is that it? Are we finished? Are we wound up? Don't forget about us. Bring us home if that's the case. So there's a real sense of impending corporate collapse, and some of these key figures like Thomas Clarke realize, well, that if their nest is not going to be feathered by the company, which is the only reason they're in the company's employ, then they're going to see some of these opportunities themselves, and they realize that they can run this fabulously lucrative and socially rewarding private enterprise themselves. So using the company's name as the kind of official representative of the English nation, they set up these kind of bailiwicks, these kind of private fiefdoms where they're investing with Asian partners, they're marrying into the kind of Indo-Portuguese elite of these coastal communities, And yes, so Thomas Clark was really the first example of someone I would really class as truly kind of this cosmopolitan, transnational actor who's got a foot in the English and the Asian world, and is an example of the kind of actor that can tie those worlds closer together. So he's living outside of the factory in his own sort of palace. He's got an army of he's got an army, his own private army. He's got an army of servants. He's carried around in his fabulously wealthy palanquin. The people that kind of visit fresh out from England, consider him more of a kind of Asian prince than an English merchant. And there's one of them specifically, Andrew Cogan, who's kind of scandalized, and he's, these are petty kings. They've got all the power and privilege and wealth, and for some it's it's a scandal. This is corruption. I put that in quote marks that you can't see, of course. Definition of corruption obviously being highly contested, but for a lot of people this was the new key to success. They had to anchor themselves in and kind of agilely or nimbly insert themselves into these kind of local social and commercial hierarchies, and only then could they open up new opportunities for the company itself of investment, of demographic resources by people actually emigrating and moving to company cities and helping to increase trade and establish them as places to visit by other traders. And it's, I call him kind of ground zero, Thomas Clark, because in terms of the archival record, he's the most kind of obvious actor. But it's worth saying that by at least the 1620s in Surat and on the western coast of India, private trade had become so synonymous with establishing relationships with the Indo-Portuguese that it was known to be a private trader was known as to be a Catholicer, someone who's indulging in the Catholic religion, who's kind of going all in the Indo-Portuguese culture. So it's that kind of relationship between establishing or integrating with existing Asian and Indo-Asian communities, Indo-Portuguese communities, and having kind of achieved some level of commercial success. And that's that has a real impact. That's, for me, Thomas Clark is they get rid of him, they're scandalized by him, but he is, it's established, it's a dynamic that works. The company as a official corporation is failing, and yet here's the beginning of this thriving private world of company servants finding their own way in Asia, and that's largely by adopting kind of local customs and cultures and really becoming part of the landscape in a way that the company as an official actor of the English state can't be seen to kind of be subordinating itself and to becoming so kind of native in a way. It does so later, but at this early point in the early 17th century, it's left to the servants to do it, and the servants at this point are more successful than the company itself, which is a strange dynamic by the sort of mid 17th century. So people like Thomas Clark are by the 1630s, 1640s, they start to lead the way as the company itself crumbles.
It just occurred to me then that it just seems like the worst case of incompetent managers telling you how to do your job.
Yeah.
That these servants out in Asia making a vast amount of wealth and clearly succeeding, and then receiving angry letters from the bosses back home saying, "What are you doing? You should do it our way. We know the proper way to do it."
Of course, yeah, and that's certainly in the first half of the book. That's kind of the central, point of contest that I like to focus on. Is that, and it's part of talking about how does overseas European enterprise, how does it work? And at the center of that private kind of integration and expansion is a real kind of flashpoint of conflict between what the nation state demands and what metropolitan authorities like the directors and the English shareholders demand, and what is actually possible or practical beyond the Cape of Good Hope. And there's a real kind of fissure of kind of conflict, and some of it turns spectacularly violent as the kind of court of directors, and London tries to assert itself, and kind of withering its presence in Asia by abandoning factories, scaling down investment, reducing shipping. In a way, it's kind of surrendered its control of English expansion or English policy to its servants, and they so in a way they're filling a vacuum by the kind of withering corporate framework, to the point that they're then able to reshape what the company becomes and how it operates. And I think part of it is that it's how do long distance enterprises operate, and traditionally historically has been concerned this idea of this kind of the agency problem, that understanding how the company operated was understanding how governors or the directors or the investors got control of wayward or corrupt servants. And I think there's a fabulous book by Emily Erickson, Monopoly versus Free Trade, which showed that actually this kind of decentralized dynamic in which the captains of East India Company ships and their servants kind of lead the way is actually very successful, because they know what they're doing, they know what conditions are like, they know what it takes to succeed in and to do trade deals and to succeed diplomatically. And the correspondence, because obviously heavily focused on kind of the correspondence coming from London to Asia, it's heavily focused on this being a problem, and it's a problem that needs to be resolved. And the historic theme, kind of past 20 years, is focused on what mechanisms were developed to keep these wayward servants under control. And it's fed into a flourishing, historic on corruption in the early modern period, and the lines between what's public and what's private. But in a way, I think that misses the point. I think that the successful European enterprises in Asia were ones that were highly decentralized and led by servants on the spot that were able to adapt and, in a way, drag the company willingly or unwillingly into these sort of new opportunities. Otherwise, if it's led by London, it's going to be largely led by a national interest, which kind of undermines the effectiveness of the company as this autonomous, agile actor that can dip in and out of different political and cultural systems. So I think by the mid 17th century, the company servants are reconfiguring the aims and the capabilities of the company, and doing it in a far more kind of local context rather than a national English enterprise, which just didn't work. No one wanted their goods. They didn't have the resources to sustain that presence. They couldn't compete with the Dutch, and instability at home in England is undermining the whole process. And servants just realized that had to be abandoned, and that they had to find their own way, and they do.
So the company servants realizing the benefits of integration with these Asian societies, that seems to be one significant turning point that you present in the book. But the other seems to be the founding of Madras, modern Chennai. So I'm wondering if you could explain, why was Madras founded, and why did Madras succeed when all its predecessors either failed or just kind of scraped along?
Yeah, I think, and you're absolutely right. For me, the founding of Madras was the kind of the period in which the company starts to climb out of the hole it's getting itself into. So, I mean, that does take a while, but around the kind of mid 1630s, when it looks like the Crown's abandoned the company's monopoly, and there's a general economic crisis, historiographically, which is still massively debated. Was it Spanish silver? Was it pre-existing inflation? There's a whole different reason, but that generally the liquidity of the company, its ability to raise capital, was severely curtailed and limited, and it's withdrawn a lot of its factories, and its presence has shrunk to just a handful of factories across the whole kind of Indian Ocean. So for me, it's the kind of the crux of, if the company was ever going to fail, it was going to be at that point. And company servants were sort of well aware, especially a lot of our historiography is focused on Surat and the west coast of India, and the company was quite well integrated into the Western Indian trading system, with its links to Persia and the Red Sea and East Africa. But not really enough's been done, I think, in this period on the Coromandel coast, and certainly the trade had gotten so bad that the company servants in places like Masulipatam and Bantam were begging for money. They hadn't seen chess of money, in 3 years, I think by 1636 or 37, and they were all sort of getting ready to depart, really. So for me, it's that when Francis Day negotiates for the grant of what becomes Madras, it's a point that that reverses the company's fortune. I mean, that the benefits aren't seen for a couple of decades, but for me, it was a really interesting turning point. So I think it's the first settlement to be acquired when the company servants have begun to abandon the official kind of corporate framework of promoting national interest, of adhering to company rules and policies, and they're starting to insinuate themselves in their local context and rely not on Europe for their investment or orders or capital or whatever, but from but with the local Asian constituencies in which they formed relationships with. So for me, it made the foundation of Madras totally different. I think that's reflected in its first few years. So the grant for Madras is this kind of spectacular document, which for too long has kind of been looked at as the way in which the company was able to extract advantages from this Asian ruler. But actually, I think what I've tried to do is restudy the grant for Madras in which was made in 1639 and 1640, as actually, it's the stipulations of what the company are responsible for in terms of shipping and improving the economy of the region, and in creating a strong fortress. There was a lot of promises that the English made, and in return they would obviously get a territory to establish a fort and to trade customs free, and so it wasn't a document extracted from an Asian ruler, but it seemed to be a kind of a form of partnership or collaboration in which there's a governor of a local Nayak, who were very powerful district rulers in southern India, wanting to consolidate his own authority, improve his own revenues, and invited this kind of commercial actor in on the promise that they would fortify and consolidate his authority and act as loyal subjects. So it's really interesting, this idea of integrating politically. And in the first few years, the company or the servants on the spot marry into local Indo-Portuguese families. So we often think of Madras as this tabula rasa, this kind of blank space. It's often described in history books as this kind of stretch of empty sandy beach, which is complete rubbish. It's situated in a very densely populated, highly complex agrarian region, which has very extensively developed textile manufacturing centers, and it's embedded in the Vijayanagaran Empire, which is the last great Hindu empire on the Indian subcontinent, which has kind of shrunk to the kind of very south of India. And the nearest or the biggest city to Madras was just 3 miles away. It's San Tomé. It's a Portuguese settlement. And the Mylapore region, which surrounded Madras, was home to very dense populations of Indo-Portuguese families. And the company get this grant, but they've got nothing. The ships they moved to Madras with have been sunk. There's no money coming out of London. They present a really pathetic spectacle of the usual story for Madras is, the English march out of their ships and they play the trumpet and they're waving the flag, and it's just not what happens. Actually, what happens is they're landed and their ships are wrecked, and they turn up at Madras with mostly Indian Indo-Portuguese merchants and soldiers from a settlement they had abandoned further up the coast. There's only, I think, about maybe a dozen English amongst them, and they immediately attract migration to their new territory of Madras by trying to incentivize the Indo-Portuguese and Indian dyers and weavers and those involved in textile production. And they do that by offering concessions on customs taxes, by offering them, free homes and lots of privileges. So it's about being able to attract these existing communities to them, as opposed to building entirely new colonial communities. That doesn't happen, and therefore it's this sort of joint enterprise, and they're very successful. And kind of within a couple of years, there's 400 Indo-Portuguese and Indian families living. But what I found really significant in terms of understanding what the company was and how it operated, and how it's usually understood as this kind of fiscal military actor projecting England's power overseas, is that none of what becomes Fort St. George, which is the fort at Madras, none of it is actually built or financed by the company itself. It's done through private initiatives of company servants, whether it's their trading partners that lend the money, the capital, or whether it's the company servants themselves using their profits from private trade to finance the building. And there's some absolutely rich and great material of one of the first company servants to be stationed at Madras, well, its founder, Francis Day, this is such a private initiative that he's funding one of the stone bastions of Fort St. George himself, and it's absolutely kidding him. It's one of his colleagues, goes to the court of committees, the directors, and begs them to relieve him. It's costing him 10,000 pagodas or something, which is almost his entire private trading fortune. And the other three bastions were built through the capital borrowed or lent by Indo-Portuguese or Indian merchants. So it's a real kind of Anglo-Asian enterprise, and it's the first settlement really that grows up through this new kind of strategy of utilizing local sources of authority, the Nayax grant, and of commerce and capital, and so it's unique in that respect. And it's uniquely successful as well in this earlier period. The company itself are outraged that they've gone off and built a new settlement at a time when the company was actually shutting settlements down because it couldn't afford them, and they do their utmost to try and undermine Madras. They send no shipping there, no money. In fact, an English company ship sails past Madras, and the servants at Madras actually grab it and steal some chests of money off it to fund their early investments. And they write this letter to the director saying, "I'm so sorry we had to do this, but you kind of gave us no choice." So when we look at the East India Company's early development, we think of it as empire building. It's such a misleading description. This, the early success and growth it has is largely to these private initiatives and to the resources and power of these Indian and Indo-Portuguese elites that are willing to not just invite Europeans in to settle there, but to partner with them, to lend money to them, to sustain their presence, and to patronize them as well. And there's a series of new grants over the next 20 years that follows as the company really attempts to market itself as this loyal subject of these regional rulers, and the powers that they get to govern Madras, for example, judicial powers to try crimes and to hold courts and to exercise maritime jurisdiction and to expand their fort. These all come from these charters or grants that are issued by local Indian rulers. So the development growth of Madras is very much part of a local framework and not a national English one. So that's why I think it's such a turning point. And what happens is that most of the settlements that are then subsequently established follow this strategy. I'm thinking of Calcutta especially. It's very much formed locally by company servants in partnership with local elites. And that's why I think it's worth making a big deal with the foundation of Madras, not for the usual traditional reasons of this is an example of English superiority or success, but really it's an example of how weak English national interest had become and how important private agency was in integrating the company. That's where success lay, in working within and with local frameworks and elites, and this is not an English world, this is an Asian world, and the English are learning to work within it.
I think you make it very interesting in the book the way that these private actors, they bring advantage to the company, they bring the company back and they stop it collapsing. But at the same time, it's a source of friction within the company agents themselves. I think you start the book with essentially what seems to be like a coup. One faction imprisons another faction, and both sides are company servants with their Asian allies.
Yeah.
But it's part of a larger power struggle, and the company is just part of it.
Yeah, so I think and that's really part of the tension between as the period, this 10-20 year period in the mid 17th century when the company is decentralizing. It's being power is shifting from the corporate framework and the kind of interests of the nation state to these servants and their private networks, and that's not done. That doesn't happen peacefully or willingly. That's contested at every stage, and I think that. The book paints a very positive picture of the way in which the company's development is decentralized and led by this, conscious effort to integrate themselves locally and utilize that, and how this was not directed by English national interest or even by the company itself. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, the kind of consequences of that were. So this Hobbesian nightmare of this patchwork of these fiefdoms and violence and faction and instability. So if you take a kind of bird's eye view of the company's presence around 1650, 1660, it's in complete chaos, and that's part of the kind of transition, this decentralization. And when that's eventually embraced by the company and becomes a sort of English strategy overseas by the end of the 17th century. Before that point, it is an absolute mess. And I think what I wanted to do was in highlighting just how important faction became in these company settlements as private interest was basically rampant and unregulated, is that it showed how unimportant kind of English ideas about political economy and order and reformation of manners and all of this stuff that there's been a lot of work done on it. Just, Miles Ogborn's fantastic book Indian Ink about this idea that order and social conformity was established. Even the older 20th century, even the Victorian historiography, which showed that these English cities and towns were bastions of stability amongst the kind of chaos of Asia. That's not the case remotely whatsoever, and that with spaces which are unregulated and that are run by private interests, they are violent and they are factional and they are unstable. And Madras is a perfect example of that. The important element in Madras is not the English agent or governor. It's the Asian elites that are using Madras for their own purposes. So there's the company government of Madras, which is located in Fort St. George, the fort. But then there's Madras town itself, which there's perhaps maybe 400 or 500 English in Fort St. George, but there's, well, the estimates wild massively, but even if we take the smallest, maybe 50,000 people in the Madras town itself. It's an important demographic center. It's an important center of trade and also culture. There are important or significant religious temples established there. It's a meeting point between Armenians and Jews and Gujaratis and Persians, and so it's emerging as an important port in the Indian Ocean world. And Indian elites are using the company as much as the company are using them. And part of that is it kind of splits these company servants. How can they best exploit this unique opportunity? And they're often on opposing sides of these private networks. And Madras becomes really interesting because it's dominated by two Indian castes, which we've anglicized to the left hand and the right hand caste, and they have different boundaries in the town. They patronize or maintain different religious processions. It's a complete division of the town. There's some overlap, but generally they while they reside within Madras, they're governed by a wider kind of cultural, religious frameworks that cover the whole kind of region and not just Madras, and therefore the English have little control on that, and they're just kind of, in a way, they're just pawns in these caste conflicts and attempts to dominate the port itself. But there's that side of it. It's kind of the impact of the English integrating themselves with these pre-existing contested networks and factions and religious divisions. So that was one way to also show, that the English are the minor player, certainly still in the 17th century. But then, there's, as the company decentralizes and there's a power vacuum, power vacuums are filled, and there's immense struggles all across the company settlements as to which private faction is going to be the one to profit the most from the company's decentralization. So there's a fantastic episode in the 1660s in Madras where this kind of coalition of company servants and Indian elites have formed to ensure the town remains predominantly Catholic or Hindu, that the town remains predominantly in the control of certain Indian groups. And the company at the same time want to regulate Madras more. They send a new governor out. They want to anglicize it more, establish an Anglican church, and they send out a new reverend, and they want to plug Madras more firmly into the corporate framework. After 1658, when it gets its permanent charter and kind of rejuvenates and attracts more capital, and the English state is more capable of kind of inserting itself overseas. And so there's this kind of two forces, this decentralized transnational force that wants to shape the company, and there's this kind of attempt by the company itself to reinsert itself in the kind of settlements that it's acquired in this kind of period. It's complete chaos. There's military coups, people are locked up, there's purges and massacres, and Madras is basically virtually independent for 3 years. This rebellion led by this chap Sir Edward Winter, who profits more from Madras being under the control of Indian elites than it does being under the control of the East India Company. And the company, London, have to send out a military flotilla to regain control of Madras. And in a way, that's also another key turning point, when the company realised that if they don't allow for private interest, then they're going to be constantly caught up in these factional struggles and these rebellions. And it's after they regain control of Madras that, instead of punishing the rebels, the Anglo-Indian coalition which sees control, they modify them. They grant, with private trade had been illegal, they legalized private trade, and from that point on, from kind of the 1670s onwards, the company becomes more responsive to the demands of its servants and their kind of cross-cultural networks. So that also represents an important shift. So there's the downside to private interest is that it's it's politically quite chaotic, and these English plug themselves into these kind of existing Indian conflicts and contests. But the other side is that it's a painful learning experience for the company's metropolitan authorities, and they realize, they make a very smart decision where the writing's on the wall. The company has decentralized, and in their absence, it's fully entrenched not in Anglican English European ways, but in kind of Catholic and Hindu and Muslim ways. And its settlements have these massive populations that are not English or Protestant, and they have to cater to those needs. And you see that by the end of the 17th century, that the company is transitioned to something that's far more hybrid and transnational, which wasn't the intention in 1600 when Elizabeth launches the East India Company. Its prime aim is to, acquire markets to vent English goods, but by 1700, it's about as far away from that as it can be.
So this has been incredibly fascinating, David. If listeners want to read more of your work, The Origins of the British Empire in Asia is available, but it's more of a scholarly work. But I believe you are currently working on something that might be more of interest to a general readership.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So that's out with Cambridge University Press, was out in the summer at the height of the pandemic. And you're absolutely right. It's my first kind of monograph. It's quite a scholarly piece of work, and But my next book project, which I've just kind of signed a contract for, which I can't be too specific about that yet, but it's an early modern history of the British Empire from a non-British perspective, and it's a global history. So yeah, I'm kind of moving beyond just looking at the English in Asia and looking at the expansion of the British Empire in the Atlantic and in Africa and the Mediterranean, as well as Asia, but looking from a non-British perspective. So how did the cultures and states that encountered the British, and it's taking a familiar theme from this first book. It's looking at the resilience and the diversity and the capabilities of these cultures and states, which often disappear very early on in narratives of the British Empire, but this book makes the argument that they endured in remarkable ways and were not just shaped by the British, but in turn were able to shape the British themselves and the way in which the empire developed. So it's got fantastic case studies looking at obviously the way in which the English established colonies in places like Virginia, but the way in which the Powhatans are able to resist and then accommodate and then transform the English presence there, all the way through looking to the way in which the rise of Bombay is actually more of a marginal footnote in the rise of the Maratha Empire. And so it's got these kind of surprising twists on what are probably well-known stories. But that goes all the way from 1500 to 1800. And I can say that that's due out in 2022. With you're right, with a non-academic publisher, so it will be far more accessible and very narrative driven, but still retaining that kind of core archival research. And I'm doing the same thing as I do with Asia, is looking at sources that that kind of are able to flip the perspective away from the British and to understand what becomes the British Empire by 1800 was not intended. It was an entirely different beast, and that's largely because of these resilient, powerful non-European actors that are able to shape the way the British expand overseas. So hopefully it's an empowering global history. It gives a stronger voice to non-European, non-white actors that are often passive victims in colonial histories.
I'm really excited to hear more about that, hopefully in the new year. And I should say that Origins of the British Empire in Asia, while it's still academic, is still highly, highly readable, and I would recommend it. There's a paperback version due out in 2021, I believe.
Hopefully, yes.
Hopefully. So when that does emerge, I will make sure to let people know, because I highly recommend it. It's really, really good. And on that note, thank you very much, David, for coming on. This has been a real delight.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sam, for having me. It's been great to chat. Thank you.
Since speaking to Dr. Veevers in December, he has been able to reveal more information about his upcoming book. It will be called The Mirage of Empire, a new history of the world at the dawn of British expansion, due out late 2022. It takes a non-European perspective of Britain's expansion and argues for the resilience and power of the non-European states Britain came into contact with, and their ability to resist and even reshape Britain's expansion for far longer than we usually think. The title refers to the mirage erected by the Victorians who sought to rewrite this earlier period of encounter and portray everyone else as barbaric, or spaces as empty, etc., when in fact they were anything but. So it's peeking behind that mirage and revealing the richness of the early modern world. It sounds like a fantastic, fascinating book, and I cannot wait to read it. Thanks once again to Dr. Veevers for coming on the show, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.